mes fonctions de président de Conseil.
I resume my functions as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of the Syrian Arab Republic.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's paradoxical, Mr. President. It really attracted my attention during this meeting that is dedicated for the humanitarian situation in Syria, my country, all over the country and not only part of it, that some colleagues, some speakers, especially the permanent representatives of Sweden, Kuwait, the USA, the UK, and France, have had a real, unprecedented presence of only very narrow angles of this resolution. The one related to the extension of the so-called cross-border assistance. It was repeated at the beginning of all their statements. So they were only keen for the extension of this mechanism so that we can surpass the Syrian sovereignty by extending the cross-border assistance. That's the core issue. They turned a blind eye to the fact that such operations, so-called cross-border assistance, only covers only 5% of assistance delivered to Syrians. So 95% of humanitarian assistance is delivered within Syrian territories and not across the borders. Of course, this is besides the issue of using the border crossings with Turkey to smuggle weapons and terrorists instead of humanitarian assistance. It's a long story, and we've already touched upon it time and again. And there are tens of Turks in our prisons, or actually in Turkish prisons, because they have uncovered this fact, i.e. the convoys sent through the borders do not deliver humanitarian assistance. Instead, it delivers weapons. Despite of this picture, some are still looking for angels. 8 years after this terrorist war launched against my country by a devilish coalition, some of them are present in this chamber, after 8 years, some are still looking for a specific gender. We're discussing today the 58th report of the Secretary General on the humanitarian situation in my country, Syria. As you all know, the Council has adopted many resolutions and held many formal and informal meetings to that end. And I believe that it's high time for this august Council, following all these resolutions and meetings, to beg the following question. Is the aim from these reports, sessions and resolutions is really to enhance the humanitarian situation in Syria? Or are some trying to only bring political pressure to bear on the government of Syria and use the suffering and pain of Syrians as a commodity for cheap political trade-off? And would like to stress that if the objective was, as some allege, is to enhance the humanitarian situation in Syria, then what's needed today is not to adopt new resolutions or hold showy meetings. Instead, we need the following. 1. Assist the Syrian government to combat the remnants of the armed terrorist groups, which were the main reason behind the humanitarian crisis and its escalation, including the crises of displacement and asylum. Anyone following the crisis who's really anxious for the prosperity of Syrians would notice that the humanitarian crisis did not surface but in areas infiltrated by these armed terrorist groups, harboring illegal foreign forces. Damascus has 8 million inhabitants. 8 million. We do not face any humanitarian problems. There are no humanitarian crises in Damascus or Aleppo or Homs or Hama. These are all under the control of the state. Humanitarian crises are only prevalent in areas under the control of armed terrorist groups and areas infiltrated by foreign colonization. You've all talked about Darfur or Kobane. Who's protecting terrorists in these areas? Aren't they the U.S. forces? Second, the Security Council must shoulder its responsibility by taking serious and immediate steps to stop the aggression, massacres, and systematic destruction of infrastructure in Syria, committed by the illegitimate coalition led by the USA. They have to work on compelling the countries of that illegitimate coalition to abide by the provisions of the UN Charter and your Council's resolutions, which all stress the rejection of such aggression crimes or the interference in the internal affairs of countries on undermining the territorial integrity of member states, as if all this did not come in resolutions, instead in the poems of Shakespeare 400 years ago. Thirdly, the immediate lifting of unilateral coercive measures imposed by some countries. Some of them are present here in this chamber. I mean the member states and the Security Council, who have imposed measures against the Syrian people. These measures have deeply harmed the livelihood of Syrians. My colleague, the ambassador of the Russian Federation and the ambassador of Bolivia have thankfully touched upon these. The continuation of such measures, which are described by some as sanctions, they are not sanctions because they were not imposed by the Security Council. They are unilateral coercive measures rejected by the so-called international community. The United Nations is against such unilateral coercive measures, and every year in the GA we adopt resolutions against such measures. The continuation of such measures is the main obstacle today in the face of ensuring the provision of basic needs of Syrians and supporting their livelihood and humanitarian situation and providing them and responding to their basic needs through setting the stage for the repatriation of the displaced Syrians and the refugees to their homes and normal lives. Fourth, increasing international humanitarian assistance to respond to the needs of Syrians, especially in light of the current state of financing of humanitarian assistance, which is still under expectations, as was stated by Mr. Lowcock. And because donors are still in their theatrical conferences, linking their financing with political conditions that run counter to the principles of humanitarian work. They refuse the reconstruction of the basic service facilities in Syria to support the resilience of Syrians and the return of refugees and internally displaced to their homes with dignity and safety. We've listened to the statements of our colleagues, the representatives of the USA, the UK, and France. They have talked extensively about linking the reconstruction and the return of refugees to their political conditions set to stop supporting terrorism. Fifth, stop the politicizing of the humanitarian track in Syria, including stopping providing falsified information and figures, and stop the ignoring facts and changes and alterations on the ground. Of course, when we discuss this issue, we have facts and figures, evidence to what we state. Some, when they falsify their statements and say that only 4 convoys have reached their destination in a particular month, or 5 humanitarian convoys have reached X or Y, this is not correct. I was in Damascus a few days ago, and I have visited the head of the Syrian Arab Red Crescent, and I asked him, how many convoys were sent, Mr. Lowcock, since the beginning of this year and up till this very day? He gave me this table. These are all convoys that arrived since the beginning of the year. The total number of the convoys is 182 convoys only from the Red Crescent. And some in this council come to bring falsified information and say that only 4 convoys were sent, or only 12 convoys were sent. And when they send a convoy to Rakban or Tanf with our consent, they provide it to the terrorists. It does not get delivered to the 50,000 civilians who are in dire need to assistance. The convoy, Mr. Lowcock, that went to Tanf ended up in the hands of the terrorists, and you know that full well. Mr. President, extending the provisions of Resolution 2165 does not reflect the recent developments on the ground since it was adopted on the 14th of July 2014, because there is no longer need for cross-border humanitarian assistance after we have regained control on all areas categorized as besieged or hard to reach. In this vein, I would like to stress once again that the government of Syria is the most anxious to provide all sorts of humanitarian assistance to its people wherever they are, all over Syrian territories. This is our duty, and we undertake it duly in cooperation with the Syrian Arab Red Crescent. And the government of Syria will remain committed to such a duty. I would also like to stress that my country is keen to cooperate and coordinate with the UN and its humanitarian partners in line with the guidelines governing the cooperation and coordination of humanitarian work, which stress on the need to respect the sovereignty and independence of countries and the role of the countries concerned in overseeing the distribution of humanitarian assistance within its territories, as well as the respect of the principles of impartiality, integrity, and non-politicization. There is a country in Syria, a state that deserves respect from all, in implementation of the resolutions of this Council and the provisions of the Charter and the international law. That's the main issue. However, when some here and there reflect in their statements that there is a regime or other terms, this is not an adequate statement from this Council or their speakers. The insistence of some members of the Council to extend the provisions of the resolution and their deliberate turning of a blind eye to the observations, the critical ones presented by my country, in addition to the extension of this resolution, does not in any way negate the defects of this resolution or its implementation since the very first day of its adoption. And allow me to briefly refer to those defects on the hope of not committing them again later. 1. The hub for humanitarian assistance on the Syrian crisis is in Damascus, the capital of Syria, and not, as the resolution is trying to promote, the Turkish Entebbe Ghazi office or any other place. 2nd, receiving the consent of the government of Syria before the access of humanitarian assistance across its borders is a fundamental principle pursuant to GA Resolution 46/182. And we should not simply inform the country, as stated in the resolution, because such a move is similar to the consultation project that was presented by some. They said they have consulted us. This is correct. However, they did not take into consideration any observations that we have presented. Is that consultation? 4th, the UN monitoring mechanism cannot, it's actually incapable of verifying the delivery of cross-border assistance and the fact that they reach their beneficiaries still this very day. The great majority of such operations are currently undertaken across the Turkish-Syrian borders, and they are directed to areas under the control of the armed terrorist groups that confiscate such aid and distribute it to its own elements and families, as what happened in 10th. The mechanism stood idle by over the past 4 years in countering the misuse of those borders by some neighboring countries who have used it to provide support to armed terrorist groups. And smuggle what was looted by these groups from factories, antiquities, or petroleum products inside their own territories. Fifth, the efficiency of cross-border assistance was and remains limited if compared with assistance distributed from within the Syrian Arab Republic, as I clarified a while ago. Sixth, the workers in OCHA did not uphold the principles of transparency or provide the necessary guarantees to convince the international community that the cross-border assistance reach those who deserve it and not the armed groups. They could not, in OCHA till this very day, provide adequate explanation on the so-called partners or independent companies, those third parties that were contracted to verify the delivery of assistance to the war houses and the beneficiaries despite our repeated requests. Seventh, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, this designated as a terrorist group on the Security Council's list, has imposed taxes on assistance that is delivered across the border, especially the Bab el-Hawa border crossing and the Turkish-Syrian border. This is considered the direct financing of terrorism in violation of Security Council resolutions, especially resolutions 2178, 2253, and 2396, just as did the government of Qatar when it paid millions of dollars to ISIL and the Nusra Front in the occupied Golan Heights under the pretext of paying the ransom to free the hostages taken by those terrorist groups, which is again a clear violation of the resolutions of this Council, especially Resolution 2368. To conclude, Mr. President, the government, people, and army of my country knows very well who's our enemy and who's our friend. We know full well that combating terrorism is a war imposed upon us by the sponsors of terrorism to drain us in order to push their unjust plans in the region, foremost being liquidating the Palestinian question and drowning the peoples of the region in bloody obscurism fueled by the extremist Wahhabi ideology, ignorance, and servicing agendas of destruction. My government now, more than ever, is adamant to fight the remnants of armed terrorist groups in Idlib or elsewhere. We're adamant to exercise our legal right for self-defense and expel all foreign occupying forces which entered our territories illegally. And the representative of the USA discussed and said blatantly that his country has paid $8 million to sponsor and finance terrorism in Syria. He called it humanitarian assistance. $8 billion. They are all financing terrorism. We will continue to reconstruct the areas destroyed by terrorists, to bring back life to its normalcy so that our people can enjoy the life they're used to before they were pushed into a war on terror. This would allow Syrian civilians to return to their homes, abandoned due to terrorism and the unilateral coercive economic measures that targeted their basic life and livelihood. The success of the adoption of the resolution of the sponsors of terrorism, destruction, and the assassins of international law does not in any way mean that their project in my country will be adopted. We promise them to foil their schemes and conspiracies. Thank you, Mr. President.